Hello and welcome to the Film Comment Podcast. My name is Violet Lucca and I'm the digital producer. The only thing more reliable than the debates surrounding each new Terrence Malick film is how reductive they are. Is he an experimental genius of lyricism, or is he just a self-indulgent has-been? For the release of Malick's latest film, Song to Song, we brought together critics
Nick Pinkerton
and
Shonni Enelow, author of Method Acting and Its Discontents on American Psychodrama and professor at Fordham University,
for a proper discussion of his strengths and weaknesses, and whether his themes will deliver you or dismay you. It all turns into a discussion about how different viewers approach art from different angles. Here's the conversation. So today we're going to be talking about a certain man, who, I was thinking about this earlier today, and I am going to try and draw this parallel. So Terrence Malick is somebody who has a career that's been sort of like Valerian Borovchik's, where Valerian Borovchik directed Blanche, his first feature film. It was a huge splash at Cannes. It was sort of obeyed all of the laws of what a European art house film should look like. It was very beautiful. And then he started to do his own thing. And if you look at Blanche and compare it to something like Behind Convent Walls, there are all these nuns running around ready to get fucked. It's completely different aesthetically. And he just really pursued what he wanted to pursue after a certain point in his career, did not give a damn. And Terrence Malick has sort of done the same thing, except for, I don't know what we can call what he's doing anything at all. Since The Tree of Life, or I mean, even before then, like when he sort of returned to filmmaking after a long hiatus, he started doing his own thing, really injecting a lot of experimentation into narrative and really pushing it further and further and further. And now with Song to Song, I don't know, what do we have?
Well, I would say a lot of that is already there in Days of Heaven.
Sure.
Which famously is a movie that was found in the shooting and in the editing, a movie that was made in a way that movies aren't meant to be. You're supposed to go in with your drum-tight script. But I was thinking about this earlier today. Terrence Malick is somebody who's been very important to me as a filmmaker since I really was getting my sea legs as a movie watcher. And earlier today, I saw Song to Song with the usual trepidation that goes with seeing a film by somebody whose body of work is very important to you, thinking like, are they going to let me down? Are they going to turf out on this one? Is this going to be the one that sort of breaks the streak? But I had the thought, I think even if I didn't respond on some level to Terrence Malick's films, even if I didn't like the work or even if the work didn't move me, I think I would still sort of take pleasure in the existence of them precisely because of the fact that he so does not give a fuck at all.
See, that's me. I appreciate they exist, but I can't get into them. But maybe, Shonni, we were talking before we recorded, and maybe we could get into why it's sort of a stumbling block, at least for us.
Oh, yeah. Well, as I mentioned this to Nick earlier, we actually watched Song to Song together unexpectedly this morning. I was saying I was very nervous about this podcast because I just have this feeling that conversations about Malick can get kind of ugly because people feel so strongly. And a lot of people whose views on film I really respect adore Malick and think that I kind of get the sense that, not to say that I've gotten the sense from you, Nick, but I do sometimes get this feeling that to be an enemy of Malick in some of these, very respectable film critics' eyes is to be an enemy of art. And so I would not say I'm an enemy. I'm not an enemy. But I have a lot of problems with the films after Tree of Life and including Tree of Life, but especially To the Wonder and Knight of Cups. I went into Song to Song really expecting to hate it. And I have to say I was actually I'm not sure pleasantly surprised is the right phrase, but I found there was more for me there than there had been in some of the others. And I was more interested in some of the choices, and I was certainly more interested in the performances. And I was, in general, more receptive to what was going on. I mean,
In Song to Song?
In Song to Song, weirdly
That's
enough.
interesting.
Yeah, I know.
Because my tolerance.
Yeah.
So I really love Tree of Life. And then To the Wonder really rubbed me the wrong way. And then I tried to, I like parts of Knight of Cups. And then Song to Song feels like a weird remake of Knight of Cups, but by far worse. It's funny because I also saw it at Landmark Sunshine. This podcast is not sponsored by Landmark Sunshine. However, if someone there is listening and would like to take this opportunity, please email me. It just like made me car sick. I had just like creeping feeling of illness, and then also like just not enjoying any part of it, and thinking back on all the stuff that I had seen before that I liked so much more, that it was kind of unbearable. But again, it's like, I thought Michael Fassbender was great. Maybe let's back up a second. Actually, let's back up a second. Let's run down what these movies are about.
Let's God.
So what is so I mean,
What are we
try
going to
not-
take one? Should we perhaps just concentrate on Song to Song? I like that you called it Song of Songs.
Yeah.
That's sort of apt,
Yeah.
really.
That's actually a better title. I agree, that's a better title.
Well, I was disappointed in that this breaks the streak of Malick films whose titles sound like Choose Your Own Adventure books. Knight of Cups, Voyage of Time, You Are a Shark, his forthcoming film. I mean, I was saying earlier, there does seem to be, whereas there's a notable progression or regression, depending on your viewpoint, from really beginning with Tree of Life, where something demonstrably different is happening in each one of the films. Tree of Life being the first film to sort of look at a contemporary world, however briefly, To the Wonder to be completely in a contemporary milieu. Knight of Cups sort of bringing the fractious, prismatic style of To the Wonder further still. Voyage of Time being a completely gonzo, out there, life, the universe, and everything sort of project.
Loved it.
And I did have something of the same feeling that you did, Violet, that there is kind of a plateau reached between Knight of Cups and Song to Song, both of which are movies that I have a lot of time for, but I definitely did not see that step forward, backwards, sideways, whatever it is. Should we talk a little bit about the actual narrative material, such as it is?
Yeah.
Well, you have basically a love triangle of sorts. You have Rooney Mara and Ryan Gosling as gigging Austin area musicians, and you have Michael Fassbender as this sort of gatekeeper, producer, glad-hander.
Lucifer,
if you prefer. I mean, in a way, it's not that different from the triangle in Days of Heaven, like Brooke Adams and Richard Gere as the sort of day laborers and the landowner, played by Sam Shepard. And there's a relationship between the Rooney Mara character, and simultaneously she is cavorting with both the Fassbender character and the Ryan Gosling character. And then they sort of spin off onto their individual narratives, each pursuing different relationships. We not atypically get glimpses into their head spaces. I would say we hear much more from Rooney Mara than we do from anyone else. And in as much as there's an identification character here, it is her. Not unlike Knight of Cups, we're looking at the ostensible subject is an entertainment industry, in this case, the music industry and the live music industry around Austin. One thing that I find very interesting is that as Malick has gotten more contemporary, as the films have been more and more couched in the contemporary world, he's simultaneously gotten more antique, more medieval, more prehistoric even, And there's a music cue very early on, which I think kind of unlocks what the movie is doing when the lute drops for the first time. And you have to think, this is indeed a movie about gigging musicians around Austin, Texas in 2012 or whenever the majority of the material was shot. It is also drawing a parallel between this situation and the situation of basically court musicians. Like that is where it is coming from, and that is, to me, sort of brilliant.
This is a little bit unfair, but why is that brilliant? What do you think is interesting about drawing a parallel between, mundane contemporary situation and a medieval era?
I mean, I think that it can be entirely interesting to pursue what is it like to be on the tatty fringes of being a working musician. If I want to watch that movie, I can watch Olivier Assayas's Clean. That movie already exists. However, I've not seen anything that plugs this very specific contemporary milieu into this larger cosmology of ideas.
Yeah, this is sort of one of the things that I have trouble with, is that I often end up feeling like that kind of plugging, right, which sort of starts with Tree of Life, I guess, and in all the later movies in different ways, to me speaks to a kind of abstraction, an idealism, right, where figures are sort of abstracted from their, material surroundings and historical specificity and put into this kind of mythic landscape, right, which I understand that is what he's doing. And, as an ideological gesture, as an artistic move, I find that pretty problematic. And
in what regard?
So ideologically, I feel like moving to abstraction flattens out everything that I think is interesting about the world, like the specificity of character and place and time and situation. And artistically, I find it a little bit cheap, actually. Like, I find it a little bit lazy.
But there's such a plenitude of specificity in other places. I mean, in terms of actual sort of tactile experience of the world, there's a absolute bounty of that specificity. So, I mean, admittedly, it is emptied out in places.
But I mean, what is? I mean, I don't mean to sort of dogpile on you, but is that? But what is that? And I'm thinking.
In terms of,
because that was my problem with To the Wonder, where I just I walked out and I was like, there are no fucking characters in this thing. On a conceptual level, I think that's awesome. I'm like, oh, somebody did a narrative without characters. That's really fucking interesting. And then to actually watch it is kind of excruciating.
I mean, in terms of specificity, I can tell you that I have a familiarity with the physical forms of Michael Fassbender, Rooney Mara, and a number of other people that I previously did not. I understand how those people exist in a space in a way that I did not, say, 4 hours ago.
Sure.
And that, to me, is specificity. What is that if not?
That's really interesting. I mean, I think this sort of actually, even though this is, we're getting into it really quickly, I think this is sort of the crux of, to me, what's interesting about the debates around these films is there are different definitions of abstraction and specificity and things like character and depth, right? Really different definitions of depth that we're working with. And so to me, it's that feels very superficial, right? The attention to bring up another obvious issue, all the attention to women's asses in the frame, and the form of bodies, right? Often feels to me very just shallow, just pure shallowness. But I understand that to others, that actually seems fascinating and rich and complex and like a cinematic gesture that means something. Whereas to me, it doesn't have that resonance.
Right. Because I'm going to say that I could never write a thesis on modern dance, but I have a concept of what the women in these films are doing, right? They're trying, as you say, they're sort of trying to fill space. They're using their bodies to express things. And it feels, there's something not fresh about the way that they're moving to me. But again, I have a familiarity. I'm not an expert. And so seeing Olga Kurylenko into The Wonder sort of dancing around and blowing into a washing machine tube as a playful gesture, I'm that's not interesting to me. I think that's kind of facile. And I
mean, I must say my experience in watching Song to Song, I had this thought, like, at a certain point, and this always happens, like, there's a certain gee whiz factor
Sure.
to Malick for me, where to a certain degree these films are just catalogs of things, and at a certain point I am very much somebody who is apt to going, gee whiz, hot air balloons are a thing, how about that?
I have that feeling too. I mean, I have that feeling too. I was like,
darn it.
he included that. Like, that's you, but that's where the wonder begins and ends for me. I'm like, he included that. Like, Michael Fassbender acting like a monkey.
And at much in the same time, while watching particularly this film, I thought to myself, my God, you can do a lot of different things with your body. Like,
it's interesting.
It's
interesting.
Like, most of the time, I'm just walking around, sitting down, like, occasionally
Sleeping.
like moving on an elliptical machine in order to keep from going into total catabolism. It's like, what an extraordinary, like, Swiss Army knife tool the human body is. Yeah. And I mean, I must say that, like, very base level, like, G. Willikers aspect of things tends to suck me in.
But Shonni, you could probably speak to this better. What irked me about Song to Song in particular is that, okay, so we have Michael Fassbender, who is, I think, a good actor, but he gets to play evil. And evil is so much more interesting than good, which is symbolized by Ryan Gosling. And it's clear that they're just kind of going. The camera turns on and they just have to go. And what Michael Fassbender does is, like, so much funnier, smarter, better in every respect than what Ryan Gosling does. And I mean, to a certain extent, sure, maybe that's what evil is. Evil is something entertaining. Yeah. But you have to spend a lot of time with good Ryan Gosling, and, like, what he says is, like, so dumb. It's just dumb to me. Like, when he's doing, like, the romantic stuff, like drawing on her with lipstick, and he's like, X marks the spot. And I'm like, how old are you? It's so stupid.
I mean, that's like that's often, I mean, and that's certainly how I felt in To the Wonder, which actually felt like really appalling to me, that it was this woman child, like, bizarre thing. But in this case, I almost felt like maybe it was because of everything that Ryan Gosling brings to him as a star, which I don't think Malick was intending at all, but there was some self-consciousness there, I felt like, in that performance of the romantic hero. And also, I felt like, in contrast again to the Wonder, Rooney Mara is such an intrinsically, to me, much more interesting performer and actor, and has a much more interesting face than really, I mean, to my mind, any of the women in contemporary Malick films. So to me, when she was doing this kind of childlike, playful stuff, it actually started to feel, especially as the movie developed, like it was this kind of pathetic thing. Like, she was this sort of, stunted person who couldn't get beyond that, and was performing joy for these men, even though she, clearly was feeling something different. So I felt like in this movie, in contrast, there was a tension to that characterization that I thought was striking. I mean, much more so with Rooney Mara than with Ryan Gosling. But even with Ryan Gosling, because of the joke about him being the romantic hero, I was like, oh, this is kind of funny. Yes, of course, Ryan Gosling as a romantic hero, being the romantic hero, doing these cliched things. Like, it had sort of an intrinsic irony to me that I found kind of compelling.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of there being a good versus evil dichotomy at work in the film, because though I don't think that that's entirely off base, I think that the way Malick thinks about these things is not quite so cut and dry.
Oh, no, I agree. I totally agree.
I always find it helpful when thinking about Malick to bring Murnau into the conversation. And if for no other reason, because I think in terms of sort of gestural camera work, they speak to one another a great deal. And I think it's worth just bringing Sunrise into the conversation because in terms of a kind of moral cosmology, the way that, at least in the last 3 narrative films, Malick has thought about good and evil sort of explodes that basic, a very simplistic dichotomy. I think about it in terms of, in Sunrise, we have the counterpoised idea of the city and the country. Very important preoccupations for Malick, and certainly they're at play in Song to Song. And we have Janet Gaynor and Charles Farrell, their relationship toxified by a woman from the city. They go to the verge of a murderous meltdown, and then go into the city, the source of this toxification, and it's the city that brings them back together. Mm-hmm. So this is something immediately slightly more complicated than merely country good, city bad.
Right.
And I think that same kind of complicated attitude is at work in Song to Song specifically, and in Malick generally, where, yes, like, there are false values being proffered in the big city of Austin, and the temptations that it holds forth, but you don't get that transformation without passing through that first. And I think time and time again, that's what I find so rich and interesting about Malick, is not only that he brings these values to play, these very, very classical values, good, evil, so on and so forth, but that he has a very holistic conception of how they all interface with one another. I mean, it comes back to, we all know, of course, Thin Red Line, baby birds struggling out of an egg in the midst of a firefight, like this idea that you cannot have one without the other. And this is something that I find infinitely rich and seductive about the films. Yeah. Is that they have such breadth, that they encompass so much. Literally, there's just so much fucking stuff in these recent films. Yeah. And I find that very, very alluring, particularly in a film culture that tends to conflate minimalism with sophistication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's like, not shit fucking happened in that movie. It's really good.
Right.
Some old Romanian guy ate mud for 5 hours. Must have been a masterpiece.
But he really wasn't eating the mud. He was performing himself eating
Was it
the mud.
Shishesco? Oh, the mud is Shishesco.
But I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I agree. Obviously, I join in on making fun of movies that 12 people see. But there's just something on the level of dialogue that, and again, this comes down to like what you look for in a movie, I guess, because like the improv, sort of like spur of the moment things that Ryan Gosling comes up with or Rooney Mara come up with don't move me. And I think sometimes they're like embarrassing and stupid. Maybe he's trying to do that on purpose, but it pulls me out in a way that I don't like, as opposed to something like Tree of Life. Because Michael Fassbender, he's bad, but there's a lot of good about him too, and you get to see that. That's even more true of something like Tree of Life, where Brad Pitt is like angry, abusive Texas dad, but he's also the wonderful and like nourishing, and his mother isn't the only source of like goodness in the world.
Well, that's such an interesting performance. That is such a weird type of mid-century American male.
Yes, even the way he stands, like adjusts his pants.
I mean, it's
everything. He like nails it.
It's my mother's father, like to a T. Like,
no, mine too.
Straight backed, like some military background. Very like disciplinarian, but also like listens to Bartok records and like weeps into his whiskey.
Like experiences like the ecstasy of music, but like is mad about the way his son turns the page, like all that stuff. It's amazing.
That is like just particular identity kit that I don't even think exists anymore. And is expressed with incredible finesse by Brad Pitt.
Still puzzling. I'm still thinking about this, what you just said, Nick, about breadth and holism. Because I think, again, it's interesting to me that I see what you're saying, and I can understand why that would be a compelling departure from the norm and, an interesting impulse. It's, to me, though, that kind of gesture and the way it feels to me in the movies actually ends up being a kind of, I don't know how to put this right, a kind of like will to power over everything, a kind of like will to mastery and to grasp the whole in a way that I actually find really disturbing and even pernicious. And it has, it goes for me to a lot of places. A lot of my references are more in theater and in literature, but Malick's vision strikes me as extremely 19th century. It's a kind of 19th century idealist vision.
I'm a man of the 19th century.
Yeah. So maybe it makes sense. With everything that implies. I was thinking about this because it struck me that in reading over some reviews of Malick's work by critics I respect, like Nick here, that 19th century reference often come up, and so too does the idea of Malick as a romantic and as an idealist. Capital R romantic and an idealist. And so I was thinking about this because that intuitively seems right to me, that there's something, specifically about idealist philosophy going on here, right? Which is this 19th century philosophy that understands truth, beauty, and goodness to be the same thing, that understands, that wants to create a total picture of the world with its, allegorical representations of worldly and godly elements, that gestures towards ideal forms in the divine. And, so I actually think that makes a lot of sense. One of the problems with idealism is also a problem that I have with a lot of Malick's films, which maybe we should just directly address, which is, idealism is notoriously misogynist because and it's actually for a deeply philosophical reason. It's because, women are of the body, right? And idealism, thinks about the mind as transcendent, right? And the mind's grasp of the world is transcendent, and women are sort of excluded from that consciousness. Also, because idealism wants to separate out sex and love, which I think also Malick is interested in doing, women sort of get cast as either the pure woman who is the object of idealized love, or the fallen woman who is, the Jezebel. And I think that Song to Song messed with that a little bit, which I was interested in, again, in Rooney Mara's performance. But in the other films, I really see that dichotomy at work.
The surfeit of Virgin Mary scattered through song to song.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess, again, it strikes me, and I think this is really interesting, that what people like about Malick and what people hate about Malick are kind of the same thing. Like I do think it gets back to this sort of worldview that is, extremely attractive and interesting to some, and extremely, off-putting to others.
The fact of the matter is, though, I've never been hugely concerned about the idea that his worldview and mine coincided. What is exciting is that he has one and has the means to express it, a unique set of means to express it. Which is not to say, and perhaps in some respects I'm more susceptible in my own personal philosophy to that worldview than others, but the idea that this is something I can subscribe to completely, that's never really entered into the consideration so much as this is an individual who is very locked into a conception of the world and has found a toolkit, an ever-developing toolkit through which to express that.
But, Nick, to do something Amy Taubin would do, you do not like Peter Greenaway. You find you're totally allergic to that man, and he does exactly the same thing Mr. Malick is doing. In that, we have
to talk about Peter Greenaway.
I'm afraid that we do.
See, I knew it was gonna get ugly at some point.
So I'm afraid that we, because it's maybe it's a concern of the actual stuff that Peter Greenaway puts into the frame, as opposed to what Terrence Malick is putting into the frame. But it's like, if you want to sort of isolate it down, it's like Peter Greenaway is taking these literally putting Jacobite theater on film with something like Baby Masson or other sort of just injecting these aesthetics into film that traditionally don't get injected into film, that are far earlier in European history.
I guess he's great.
Now
you can't do that. You can't do that.
I guess I was wrong.
No fair.
Bullshit. Come on.
This is something that I do think is worth addressing, because Violet, I think you used the phrase earlier that the movies didn't give you, I'm paraphrasing badly, but that they weren't what you were looking for in terms of character and so on and so forth. And this is something I think is perhaps worth talking about in terms of how Malick, certainly with the last few films, is discussed. I think I agree with you up to a point that this is not a mode that I am interested in seeing all the time. Mm-hmm. But there is sometimes a tone to the critical conversation, such as it is around Malick, that seems so threatened, as though there's like a genuine sense that if we don't hold the line, every movie is going to turn into these movies.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, like, as much as I don't enjoy actually watching these films, I hate even more reading pans of them.
I mean,
because they're just so, usually what it is that it's like, this old white man got to do whatever he wanted. And that is just, okay, sure. But there's like, you're going to write like 800 words on that alone.
I mean, this is, I think, been sort of a reflexive tone for writing about difficult films, which are somewhat, at least in the narrative vein, since forever. I mean, you can look at, if Moses and Aaron got like a theatrical release, I'm sure that there are at least a few write-ups which take the attitude like, we really need to preserve narrative film from this threatening element that might corrupt it. Whereas in every case, like, these are literally the only instances of this kind of film that are out there. So you don't have to like them.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that? Like in mainstream American film?
That are going to be seen by most people, let's say.
I mean, this is also interesting, right? So if you put Malick in the mainstream American film category, right? The films look, radical and transgressive in all these ways. And I mean, if you put them in another category, they don't, of course.
Sure.
Right? They look much more conventional in certain regards.
I'm not certain that I agree with that.
Okay.
I mean,
well, no, if you put them in experimental
film.
Yeah.
If you just call it experimental film, right? And you say, look, there are lots of avant-garde experiments with, radically suspending narrative and then they look different, right?
They look different. They still don't look like your average run of experimental film.
Okay,
I don't think you
Fair
could
enough.
slot them into like Ann Arbor and nobody would bat an eyelash.
Because the thing, I mean, and again, I'm sorry I have to bring up his name, Peter Greenaway. The problem, like, because whenever along back when he would actually say new things in interviews, this is probably an interview from 1983. I'm thinking of. He was talking about like no one really tries to inject. He wants to do a popular narrative. Like but experimental, and like bringing experimentation into popular narratives, that is utterly fertile, because really no one is doing that. I mean, there are certain now with, I guess they're like poptivist experimental filmmakers who sort of try and do that, but really more what they do is sort of like bring in these figures.
Who do you have in mind?
Ryan Trecarton is one. He's sort of like a poptivist experimental filmmaker.
Yeah,
if this is a new genre I'm going to invent and then like die by, sure, why not? Why not?
That's interesting.
See that book deal rolling in?
Yeah, exactly. Totally. I feel like this is a consequential distinction for me, because if I go in thinking that I'm going to see like Vanilla Sky, I'm like much more receptive to what he's doing than if I go in think, or something like that. Like,
What did that come from?
She went to a used bookstore and there were 30 copies of that DVD there.
I was just trying to think.
Sky now?
I was trying to think of like what would be like the.
I swear to God,
I just want to talk about Vanilla Sky. Okay, no one's gonna back me up here. No one does. I mean, basically, if I go in thinking, "Oh, this is a big budget American movie with a bunch of Hollywood stars in it," I'm actually much more receptive to it than if I go in thinking this is art house. Then and then I'm like, what is this shitty script doing, and what are these cliched portrayals doing? Whereas if I look at it from the angle of Hollywood film, I'm just more sympathetic to it. That's my experience.
So you like to Hollywoodize the avant-garde? Is that?
I mean, or yeah, or I guess
because let's face it, like some of the most interesting. So let's think of some. So like Busby Berkeley, Busby Berkeley, there are moments that are utterly avant-garde in those musicals. The opening number of like 42nd Street is crazy.
Well, Michael Bay exists. I mean, if we're talking about like multiplex avant-garde, there's no finer practitioner.
Yes, and some people might
It's
say
like a Burroughs-esque like cut and paste. Going on in
yeah.
this
So
film.
so obviously, so it doesn't like it doesn't exist. It's like, but there aren't like a ton of those people walking around.
But is that what you're saying? But I'm actually trying to understand what you mean when you say nobody else is doing this. Like, is that what you're saying? Are you calling Malick a multiplex avant-gardist?
I would say that he's as near a thing as we have to it. I would say that his bankability has been sorely tested in recent years. But I mean, circa 1998, The Thin Red Line, which I saw as I believe, junior in high school, it was trotted out with fanfare, if not equal to, then on something like the same standing of Saving Private Ryan, which came out the same year.
Right.
And it's been somebody threw out the Kanye West as soon as they like you make them unlike you with regards to Malick. Like, he's certainly drifted far afield from that level of mainstream recognition. I mean, I think Tree of Life was probably the last moment when he was a viable artist in that way. However, and this is something that perhaps bears discussing, he is still able to get A-listers aplenty.
I want to talk about this. Yes.
Which, and as our resident acting expert, I mean, and of course this has no bearing on the final results, but one has to assume that these are very enjoyable films for actors to make. That doesn't mean they're necessarily entertaining for people to watch. I happen to think they are, but I mean, even as like the box office grows more and more dismal with each successive
outing,
people seem to want to make these movies.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean,
to a degree, they don't want to do that with like Coppola.
Right.
People of a similar vintage and similar stature, they are not drawing similar casts.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's really interesting. I mean, so maybe now is the time to talk about the performances and the use of improvisation and all that. So, I mean, I don't know too much of the like backstage gossip about the way that he actually does this or what he's supposed to do to get these performances out of people. You know, the improvisation is this really, interesting technique that, of course, is an extremely long history. You could like trace it back to Commedia dell'arte and all that. Right? Yeah, exactly. You could trace it back to UCB. Classic shit we're talking about here.
Whose line is it anyways?
Exactly. This is real. This is like American classics. Well, okay, but gets revived in post Stanislavski, right, as this rehearsal room tactic, to spark more authentic, spontaneous performances, right, and then gets used in various ways by the great 20th century acting teachers that from which mainstream American acting descends. So the thing about improvisation that I find interesting, and that I'm certainly not the first person to say this, is that it's supposed to be this avenue to these spontaneous, authentic reactions to, surprising developments and revelations that you wouldn't have if you were channeling a script or, more constrained. But actually, and as someone who is a former acting student, has done a lot of improvisation in my time, in fact, what often happens is that because it's really hard to do it well and it's really kind of terrifying, actors often end up falling back on, stock characters or cliched poses or
whatever pleases the audience,
right, or whatever pleases the audience, or standards, sort of like stock narratives of all kinds, right? So that's often what ends up happening in improvisation, is that rather than liberating, it ends up being this extremely constraining force, because you're trying to come up with something good on the spot, and it's so scary and all this stuff, so that's sort of what I see in a lot of these improvisations in the films, or scenes that appear to be improvised in the films, is that that I feel like I'm being told that this is, a spontaneous expression of joy, but what I see is a kind of, a repetition of a cliched gesture that I know to signify joy in some way or to signify spontaneity. So it's an interesting, problem.
Yeah, because that's what it comes back to a lot for me too. And that was sort of what I was getting at with the dialogue problem, where it's like, it's supposed to be very simplistic, but it's so simplistic that it just takes me out. And it's like, okay, so I get maybe this isn't really happening. Maybe none of this is really happening, but I could be spending time with something that is digging in a way that is interesting. And fundamentally, it's just repeating what seems to me, these very old tropes and not really like adding much to them, if at all.
There's one of Rooney Mara's voiceover lines in Song to Song, I think maybe summarizes some of the responses that the dialogue gets. I think it's something along this lines of, I never knew I had a soul. I thought the word was embarrassing. And I think that very simplicity is for a lot of people embarrassing.
Yeah.
And I mean, for my part, I don't understand it. The like much derided and mocked mother father, like, are your mother and father not important to you? Do you not think about them? Is this not at the very core of who you are as a person?
Wait.
Do you not fret about if you are a good person, if you are living life as you want to? I don't understand the sort of fundamental cringe that some people get. And
but those
more
are
than that, yeah. I'm utterly baffled by charges of pretension, because
it's not pretentious.
I don't think you could get any more. I mean, you're a level above baby talk.
Yeah, that's
the
thing. That's the thing, because again, that's what gets like I said, that's what irritates me about the anti-Malick stance, is that it's like, oh, this is so pretentious. I'm like, what are you talking about?
I understand that charge a little bit, because it's about the combination. It's not about the baby talk. It's about the combination of the baby talk with these maximalist, grandiose images, right? That's what I think people are saying. Sure. I'm not sure I agree with it, but I think that's why.
I know, and it's and I disagree.
I find the tension between that simplicity and that grandiosity very appealing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, that's what attracts me to something like Voyage of Time, or even the placement of the like 40-minute sequence of like the creation of the universe in Tree of Life, because a mother says, she wonders, why did my son have to die? And then you see the creation of the universe. And it's so true. Voyage of Time, there's something just so, that movie, I was like on the verge of tears the entire time I saw it at Toronto, because it was just, those images are so beautiful. And what it is expressing, obviously he's sort of coming from this, I guess, progressive Christian, like intelligent design, let's say. But it's just so moving to me to see these beautiful images of Earth and nature and biology and life, and just be like, isn't it just amazing that we're here at all? And I say that as a completely secular person, and just to express wonder at that, and just to be like, and just be like, why do bad things? All of that stuff is like so moving to me, and I don't understand why more people don't stop and wonder that. And like, maybe the planet wouldn't be a polluted shithole if more people did that. But alas.
Well, I mean, so as to the ecological thing is actually kind of interesting to me, because I tend to think that part of the problem with our views of nature are that we maintain this kind of, holistic blue planet, wonder, magic, divine view of it, rather than understanding its, enmeshment with life and everything. Again, I think
but he addresses that in Voyage of Time.
Oh, which I haven't seen, so I can't speak to that.
Okay, because maybe you would back me up, but I think the images of like people being horrible to each other, or like horrible shit people do to each other, on that really bad digital that is inserted between these like utterly amazing, like half CGI, half like National Geographic footage of like a volcano forming an island, sort of addresses that. But
I wanted to briefly shuttle back to the dino digression in Tree of Life, and I think maybe this also loops back a little to the baby talk maximalist idea, because that's something I know a lot of people, upon seeing and subsequently, have been baffled by. And when I saw the movie when it came out or shortly before it came out, nothing could have seemed more natural to me, because that is my memory of how I thought as a little kid.
Yeah.
Like, I think a lot of children do have that sort of maximalist thing hardwired into them, where they are trying to figure out, okay, where do I fit into this entire thing? And you're also, of course, acquiring this information for the first time. You're learning about the Cretaceous era for the first time. Cretaceous. You're thinking about your small body and what that looks like in comparison to a plesiosaur, what it would look like in comparison. Those are the sort of flights that at least my mind went on quite naturally as a child. And I don't know that I'd ever seen a movie make that kind of lateral leap so beautifully as that does.
Yeah.
And not for 1 second did I think, well, why is this happening? Like, no, that's completely in keeping with my memory of how I thought when I was learning to think.
Yeah. Or just even that you see the mass extinction event, because that's something for a little mind to wrap around. It's quite a thing for a little mind to wrap around, and like how tragic, and understanding all the implications of that. It's heavy for a kid, I think.
So it sounds like you're saying that there is something intrinsically and to you guys appealingly childlike about this vision. Not childish, childlike, like in the good way.
I would say it is... childlike is not precisely
it's
the
like
phrasing that I would use.
Almost.
See, this is where I get really tense, right? When words like pure come into the conversation.
Exactly. No, I know. I mean, it's like this very... Yeah, I don't want to say childlike, and I don't want to say naive either.
I think part of what I find fascinating and is Malick seems on paper like somebody I should hate. All of the sort of ingrained ideas of what makes good film art that I have, Claude Chabrol's little themes, white elephant art versus termite art. Like, it's in complete violation of a lot of things that I basically believe to be true.
Yeah.
However, the movies overwhelm my good sense of what constitutes a proper film, and that is very exciting to me.
Yeah.
As to the issue of purity, well, it's certainly at work in Song to Song, which ends with a baptismal image.
Totally.
But again, it all comes back to this sort of view of things in the round, like that purity, it's worth very little without the taint that comes before it.
Yeah.
I found myself thinking a lot about, the song Simple Gifts, adapted by Aaron Copland, and the turning, we come round right.
Yeah.
I was sort of echoing through my head throughout.
Well, that's really nice. I mean, it sounds like
when true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we shan't be ashamed.
I went to a progressive Quaker influenced elementary school.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So
that is Quakers, right?
Shaker.
Sorry,
the ones who don't fuck.
The other one, the other one. It's Shakers.
So there's two of them left.
My elementary school wasn't Shaker influenced. I regret.
They were fucking left and right in there.
I regret to inform you. Yeah, I mean, so again, I feel like we're circling around, some
twirling, you might
say, turning around, what seemed to be the crux of this sort of divide, right? Which is, it seems to me, so it seems clear, and you just admitted it, that Malick violates a lot of tenets of good taste, right? And whether you're sympathetic to that or not, seems to, I mean, from listening to you guys talk, to me it seems like, and from other conversations I've had with people, film critics about Malick, it seems like it comes down to how you respond to the image, like how you respond to cinematic imagery, and whether you are, I'm not sure I want to say willing to be overtaken or just compelled by the wonder of the cinematic image in some sort of fundamental way, or whether your interest in film art comes through different quarters, or which I would say personally, you know, that I tend to be more interested in other things that are good that go on in film, which I guess sounds like heresy to a certain, you know, to some people, right? I mean, it's supposed to be all about the image, but yeah, I wonder how you guys would respond to that.
I mean, I am very, very much in this for anything that can stimulate the pleasure principle, which is not just to say pretty pictures, but anything which can make, as Poirot would say, the little gray cells work a little bit. Right. Anything that can present multiple opposing ideas at one and the same time. Anything that can collide beauty and ugliness. Violet mentioned these utterly crazy format shifts in Voyage of Time, where you go from like what looks like a circa 2000 like pin cam.
Yeah,
exactly. Thing has like 16 pixels of resolution
at most.
to like 70 millimeter like wide gauge clarity. And it comes down to that, really. Like these films give me pleasure. I mean, not always, they're not always scratching me behind the ears, but I am pleased by them.
Yeah.
And yeah, I do want that ravishment. Right. I really do.
Right.
I'm a dumb guy.
Okay, so we definitely do. Before we have to talk about gender in these films, right? This is super important. I mean,
I'd be dumb if I were a woman too. If the same brain were transferred.
Understood.
I'd be a dumb broad.
Understood.
The assignment
you would be a great dumb broad, Nick.
Oh my gosh.
No, I mean, I think that's really interesting. So on some level, it becomes about, you know, as much as we can and are discussing the intricacies of his artistic vision and the various ideologies that inhere therein, right? There is on some level, it's a question of personal preference. It's like, do you respond to this, you know, particularly striking an individual vision, or are you repelled by it for some reason?
Well, I mean, I will say, in hearing you talk, there's not the bad faith that is so often present.
Thank you.
I mean, so often in the dismissals of Malick, there's like, this isn't even worth grappling with.
Right.
Like, there's not I mean, I was just utterly flabbergasted in seeing some of the responses to Song. How many of them had this sort of underlying message of like, please quit, like actively trying to like wish this film out of existence.
Wow.
And again,
as if they'd never seen a bad movie or a movie they didn't like before.
And again, I can wholly understand, as you do, not responding to the films or finding that something in their worldview, you know, rubs you the wrong way. I can wholly understand that, but just to like out of hand shove them away and not even put in the work to figure out
what's going on there. And
I mean, I have long battled a inability to really love the films of Jean-Luc Godard, but like I'm willing to bump my head against them for as long as, you know, as long as I'm in this world, because you owe something of that density and of that magnitude, at least a little of your time, I think.
And so
I think that's right. I think that's right.
And so few things truly require that or ask that of you.
Yeah.
So again, it's
that's
like,
right.
if you, can I also come out as like a not Godard lover? I will say, it's like, it's fine. You can respect the effort.
Yeah.
And try and grapple.
I am a Godard lover.
Oh no!
Yeah. I mean, so
No misogyny there.
no.
Oh,
I mean,
it's actually
There's tons of
misandry.
misogyny.
It's a hatred of all humanity.
No,
really.
no, it's misogyny.
Thank you.
No, of course it's misogyny. Of course. I mean, no, I'm not a passionate declarer of love.
We don't
for
have to
good
get into this.
We don't have to get into that.
Back to Peter Greenaway.
Yeah, exactly.
Listen. Xanadu Nuts. I fucking love that movie. Belly of an Architect. Pretty good. Not great. Pretty good.
But I do think we have to talk about the portrayals of women in these films.
Okay,
and
because
what
there was a point where I hadn't really seen Terrence Malick, and so I went through all the films, and I really just hit this roadblock with The New World.
Yeah.
And I just I was like, what is this? And I mean, you had mentioned how, The Thin Red Line was sort of bizarrely pitted against Saving Private Ryan,
Right.
just because it was a war movie about World War II, the most written about historical event of all time. It's just, I feel like he can do certain things with, I guess, male characters that he's just not interested in doing with female characters, except for a certain extent in Song to Song, where I was sort of like, this is the most complex female character probably since what's her face in
Sissy Spacek.
Sissy Spacek.
No,
yeah, that's that. Yeah, in Badlands. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's interesting, right? So To the Wonder seems like the starkest counterexample to me, I guess for semi-obvious reasons.
Well, I mean, To the Wonder, Ben Affleck is sort of the structuring absence in that movie. He's an absolute sucking void at the middle of the movie.
Well, he clearly cut him out of the movie. Maybe we could. I mean, another thing that I absolutely insist on talking about is how these films are edited, because the shooting ratio on Badlands was normal, and then everything after that is 34-1 ratio, 50-1 ratio. Song to Song, he was shooting that in 2012. How many hours of footage is that? We don't know.
Right.
Without getting away from the gender issue, I was thinking about this. It is a dangerous method, and frankly,
Yes.
I am almost certainly giving the films more credit than they're due, because I don't believe that somebody with that approach could have a batting average of 1,000.
Right.
I thought about this having rewatched Jungle Fever last week, which I think is a truly awful movie. However, I find that looking at what I think are successful Spike Lee films and what I think are unsuccessful Spike Lee films, they're often not that terribly far apart in terms of the completely out there chances that they take.
Yes.
And sometimes that coalesces, and sometimes
It's him saying no at the end. No, I'm gonna say I actually really like Jungle Fever up until that moment.
there are wonderful things in it.
There are some really good things about that movie. Let's not dismiss it out of hand.
Yeah, I mean, it should be said that the Malick method is very much a don't try this at home one. But this is a lengthy digression from where you were going.
No, I mean, I guess it's. I wonder if part of the reason it is hard to talk about it is because it's hard to talk about specifically the female performances or the way he portrays women without talking about his understandings of character in general and what he does with actors in general. So it does seem germane to me.
I mean, with regards to the Wonder, like his indifference and distaste to male leads to the point of rendering them almost completely transparent as he does there. I mean, Affleck is basically a vessel for subjective gaze in that movie.
You never hear his name.
Yeah.
Right.
And he is almost completely a man without qualities. I mean, insofar as we can tell, he has like an EPA job and is possibly helping to clean up waterways in Central Texas.
He drives a truck.
Or actually, Bartlesville, Oklahoma.
Yeah.
But like, however hoydenish and strange his women are, I never thought of him as particularly celebrating the masculine.
That's true. I mean, maybe Knight of Cups is, I guess, a better example. I guess the reason that I think of To the Wonder is that there does seem to be, I guess, whereas the decision to make Affleck or to make that character the structuring absence,
he's a loaf of bread,
right? A loaf of bread, right? Whatever. The decision to make him that seemed deliberate and part of the whole formation of the movie, whereas there seemed to be an effort to, and yet an inability to conceptualize a complex consciousness in the female character. So I saw him trying for it and totally failing. Yeah. And that in a way was much more disturbing. So I think that film was really hard for me because it seems like these actors are, if not mistreated, kind of not well served by this film. But I think that there's something more broad that we can say about what's going on with the lack of female consciousness that extends beyond that film.
Because again, it's just like, this is all that I've heard, where it's just, they show up on set, Malick is just like, go. And he'll sometimes play music that you hear in the film to establish a mood on set, but he's really not directing them in a classic...
This is at the South by Southwest panel at which the Sasquatch-esque Malick made a rare public appearance. He talked at some length about the methodology, which is apparently, to return to Murnau, very close to a silent film director's methodology, where he's off camera, muttering instructions. And then I think there was a widely circulated piece around the time of the release of Knight of Cups from one of the bit players. I forget who, it's like one of the state guys who's in the movie, who's possibly Will Lennon, who was talking about being like handed a couple of like crumpled notes with some cryptic instructions on them.
Right.
So we do have some reportage that has slipped out.
Sure.
But it's the lengthiest kind of explanation that I have heard from Malick himself is that he is sort of off to the side, offering instruction, and then that is acted upon.
I've also heard that he really doesn't know what he wants until he shows up on set and is like, do it like this, prop person. And the prop person's like, you should have told me.
Do it like this, Jack Fisk, you mean?
Yes. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I just gonna say, so, and if you have actors who can do that kind of thing, like who can, jump in and be interesting and, be alive, and then, that can be really exciting. And there were some moments in Song to Song where I did find that exciting. I think Rooney Mara is a really interesting actor, and I think she makes some interesting choices in that film, and there were moments that felt really alive and surprising. And when you have when you cast actors who can't do that, it's kind of terrible. Like you're really setting them up to fail. I think there's some ethical problems there. Like it's kind of bad, I think, what he does to Ben Affleck and whatever her name is.
I seem to recall Kent writing about the movie and saying he felt bad for her while watching it. Is this a good time to talk about Kilmer? Or?
Oh God, yes.
Yeah.
Always a good time.
Yeah.
You might put a new memory card in.
The question for me in Song to Song and Kilmer's appearance really crystallized this is, and I guess I had this question with Knight of Cups too, was when is he kidding? Like when am I supposed to find this absurd, and when am I supposed to take this seriously?
Yeah.
How do you mean?
Well, so in Song to Song, when Val Kilmer shows up being ridiculous, wielding a chainsaw, I become aware that there's some irony at work here, and that we understand that this music scene to which she aspires is filled with these kind of pathetic, ridiculous figures, but then they're also,
save for Patti Smith.
Right. And then there's Patti Smith. Then Patti Smith shows up, who seems, this like shamanic, wise woman presence.
Whose dialogue closely echoes that of the prostitute that Michael Fassbender.
That's right.
And
that's right. And Natalie Portman.
Yes.
I always get those two mixed up.
That Michael Fassbender and Natalie Portman have brought home for a romp.
Right.
Yeah, other than the very sagacious Patti Smith.
Yes, yes. So I guess so then it's like I found this kind of compelling about the film. Then there are all these other moments where I'm not sure, am I supposed to find this ridiculous or not? Am I supposed to find the so and so's faux philosophical musings ridiculous or moving,
He's a very funny guy.
Yeah.
And that's very, very evident in Badlands, which is just chock
Very
a block
funny.
with screamingly funny lines. Hear the news, kid? It's in all the papers. You've been fired. And it still slips out,
funny.
quite a bit. I mean, I think it's Nick Offerman who has the tossed off line in the background in Knight of Cups. Lived my life so playing Call of Duty on easy, something like that. Or the segues whisking by.
That was funny. Right, that was funny.
Oh my God, that
was
fucking
funny.
killed me.
But then,
This is the thing that kills me, and I sound like I'm fetishistically obsessed with Malick detractors because I am, but is constantly banging on about how humorless he is by literally the least funny people you've ever read in your entire life. Like people who could not turn a witticism with a fucking gun to their head.
Oh no, I have to say that's always my favorite thing when somebody who is deathly unfunny tells a joke and then I don't laugh and they're like, "Oh, you don't have a sense of humor?" And it's like,
Right.
"Oh, that's the problem. I do.
have a sense of
Actually, sorry, sir."
An exquisite one.
So, but did you have this experience with watching the film where suddenly, I mean, and I'm actually not saying this is a bad thing.
Yeah.
I thought this was interesting that suddenly I started to listen to, the voiceovers in a different way. And I started to hear this kind of banal dialogue in a different way. And suddenly I was wondering if the inanity was being framed for me, and self-consciously. And that is something that I did not find into The Wonder at all, personally.
Well, I mean, it's certainly very, very there with the SpaceX voiceover where
absolutely
the grammar that is being used is entirely sort of lifted verbatim from movie magazines and true life romance stories. Linda Manz's voiceover in Days of Heaven, a film which gives a special thanks to Red Fox in its closing credits, by the way, is absolutely hysterical.
Yeah.
Maybe she'd meet a character.
Yeah. and those are my favorite Malick films precisely for that reason, because I feel like, it's there's a self-consciousness there that I find really fun.
I don't think it's ever fully disappeared. I think there is certainly a solemnity that is settled in. I mean, Jesus Christ, in Thin Red Line, Woody Harrelson blows his butt up.
It's true.
And repeatedly says, "I blew my butt up."
Yeah. And he's like,
That's true. That's true. That's true. That's a good point.
It's always present.
Not into The Wonder. Oh my God. There's no humor in that movie.
That's true. That's true. Maybe
I haven't seen it recently. And I think previous to Song, not that they've all been greeted by unanimous hosannas, but that seems to be the one that most people have a problem with. Even those of us who are stans will sometimes perhaps say, it's a transitional work. I mean, I loved it when I saw it, but I have not seen it recently enough in order to reassess and perhaps see my folly.
Again, it's interesting because whether or not you're attuned to the humor, whether or not you're, aware of, becomes, another question of how receptive I think you are to the film's vision.
But also it's a sensibility.
Yeah,
it's I think David Lynch has a very, I don't want to say similar sense of humor, but he can turn these little funny observations or these insertions of the two segues in a park where you should probably be walking. He can make that funny.
Right.
And I don't know if everyone finds that stuff funny. But,
again, I guess it's the combination of that with the overt philosophical musings, right, and the maximalist imagery, right. That people seem to be, and I count myself sometimes among them. Those two things overwhelm any sense that there could be irony or playfulness or
irony. I'm not certain about, but playfulness, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, the irony. I mean, the Val Kilmer. There's some irony there.
I think actually in 2000 and well, that
Not
would be
as much as there is
2012. When you point a camera at Val Kilmer today, irony just is there. Yeah.
And also, can I say, just putting making Christian Bale be a comedy writer, that's some great stuff.
That's funny.
That is. Can you imagine him? Can you imagine? But obviously there are people who in comedy who are like super serious and like awful to be around. But like, can you imagine him just like sitting in front of a Word document and being like, how do I make this fart joke better? What do I do? But well, we have to like Malick himself. We have run far over.
Okay.
And we'll clean it up in the editing.
We have to go do some bird watching now.
We have to do
go
some
twirling.
some desperate
Skirt twirling.
and then wonder.
Twirling. I've got to jump and put my whole body around a man. That's just what I've got to do.
I myself will be at an Episcopalian service. And then I'm going to watch some UT football.
Yeah.
We didn't even talk about the great touchback scene.
Oh my God.
Next week.
Next week. Stay tuned.
Part 2 of 15.
How cool is it, though, that we could have this much palaver about a living filmmaker?
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's great.
So
Agreed.
before we end, as we always do, it would be great if we could say a film that we saw recently that we liked, because I have been very busy. I have not had a ton of time to see stuff. So I'll mention 2 films very quickly. One I saw a little while ago, which is called Brothers of the Night. It is a very amazing hybrid documentary where it is about these men from Bulgaria who go to Vienna looking for work, and basically they can't find work and they just go into sex work. So they're gay for pay, prostitutes. And this documentary is comprised of like interviews with them, just sort of talking at the little boîte, or maybe it's real, maybe it's not. I will say the entire film looks like Carell, Fassbinder's Carell. It is shot the exact same way with like these amazing color gels. And there are also these sort of like staged moments where, you know, they're by the docks wearing a sailor outfit, or they're, you know, getting their hair cut. And it's pretty amazing. It's a very great thing to see, and I highly recommend it. If you're in New York, check it out at Art of the Real.
Last week, actually, I taught a film that I love, which I imagine it's not a film that is probably remote to many Film Comment podcast listeners, but it's Weird Ethical's Tropical Malady, which I taught to a class that I'm teaching, like a senior seminar that's really about like representations of the non-human, and it's also sort of about climate change, and it's been really interesting. And, you know, we were talking about it as a film that, in a very interesting way, refuses to allegorize the animal. The animal is there as a presence that is taken seriously as an other, but also as, you know, an other with whom one can be intimate. Mm-hmm. And that's like I think a really rich area of thinking about ecology right now. And I was just struck again at how, you know, gentle and yet profound that film is.
I will go with a movie which will be out here in New York on the 14th, and which I think is starting on the left coast today, called All These Sleepless Nights.
Yes.
A docu-fiction effort by chappie Michał Marczak, Polish guy whose last movie I also had a bit of fondness for, called Fuck for Forest. I think there is more than a tincture of spinning, winning late Malick in it, and maybe a dash of Wong Kar-wai as well. It is also about a privileged white man's journey, which is, of course, the only legitimate subject for art. It is
about how he's trying to bone chicks.
About how he's trying to bone chicks, but he's sad and has to do loads of drugs. It's basically a catalog. It's, as the title says, a catalog of a year's worth of late nights. Mm-hmm. Some other material as well, but it's sort of just a collated cross section of what does a year in somebody's life look like if you just take every time that they're fucked up out of their gourd and look at it. And it's just got the most like wonderful, overwhelming, again, to speak to your point, I just like to be smothered, apparently. But like,
ladies, take note.
Yeah. BBWs. It's NICK.Pinkerton. But like, it's just such a gorgeous, voluptuous like headphone movie. I'm an inveterate like head nodder at films, and this one just it had me in its spell. So those are two that I would toss out to the fans.
I just want to say I'm so glad that we ended a podcast on Malick by sexualizing Nick. We did it!
Doesn't feel good when you guys do it. Feel weird.
You've been listening to the Film Comment Podcast, produced by Violet Lucca and Nicholas Rapold, and edited by Michael Odemark. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. Film Comment is a bi-monthly magazine published by the Film Society of Lincoln Center. Since 1962, Film Comment has featured in-depth reviews, critical analysis, and feature coverage of mainstream, art house, and avant-garde filmmaking from around the world. Visit us online at filmcomment.com/subscribe to purchase a digital or print subscription to the magazine. Film Comment, at the heart of film culture for over 50 years.